are all about energy. And so all day long, we're experiencing different emotional states. And so looking at the pictures, there are times where we want to feel like Miss Breathe, where we want to feel cool, calm, collected, and in control of the situation. And there are other times where you're just trying to keep it all together. And that's okay. It's like that for us, and it's also like that for our students sometimes. Um, so one reflection I think it's always good for us to have is, what does it feel like to be in a classroom with me? If students are in the classroom with us, sometimes for 45 minutes, 60 minutes, sometimes for 120 minutes, what is that atmosphere? What is that feeling? What are the emotions that they're perceiving in that space? It's a question I ask myself very often, and I think it's a good question as educators to think about. What does that space feel like? So going back to what we were talking about a moment ago about this idea of safety, when our students come into the classroom, to our schools, they're scanning for safety roughly every quarter of a second. And that's quite incredible, isn't it? And so they're trying to understand, is this a safe space? And I remember when I was doing my teaching practice, I had a wonderful psychology professor, and it's always stayed with me, something that she said was that you never know what a child is leaving in the morning. You don't know what they're leaving before they come into the school. And so we have this responsibility to somehow embrace them, and that they know in this space, this is about learning, there's no need for fear. And so encountering a face that's settled, receptive, can give that start to allow learning and studying to take place. And so there's so many different ways we can do this. And I'm sure you have so many more that you could share. Just, tapping into how they're feeling, greeting them at the door. Also with primary, that we do this very often with primary, understanding if they need a hug or if it's a high five. We can also gauge how they are. Sometimes also with adults that I teach, we always do a little check of the temperature in the room. If it's a great day, are they feeling a 10 or are they feeling a 1? And that's very important for me to know how emotionally, how are they feeling? And then I might have to, change things accordingly, change my lesson plan, because we also have to be flexible in that, don't we? And so there's so many different things that we can do. But one reflection I do have is that I feel sometimes we tend to do a lot of this in primary school. And then as we go up towards middle school and high school, sometimes we put less attention on this. I don't know if you agree with me. And I think, especially when we think about teenagers, and we saw this picture of teenagers walking into the school before, sometimes they're very vulnerable, and maybe we need to understand even more with them how they're feeling. Um, think when we're talking about the safe space and welcoming students, we can never, ever underestimate just the power of a smile. Because it's you, as we said before, we don't know what their day has been like so far. And so sometimes seeing somebody giving you a nice big smile can lift, because we said before that we perceive things, emotions are catching. If I show you this picture here, I can't, you have your cameras off, but I can see Jose smiling. We perceive, we feel what other people are feeling. And I'm sure we've all had this situation where, maybe you're having a bad day and you go into the staff room of your school and everybody's laughing and joking, and somehow you can feel your humor lifting as well. So emotions, going back to this idea of emotions, are really catching and very, very important in the learning process. When we have the sense that the people around us are accepting, they're curious, they're not judging us, then we have a feeling of being safe. And on the other hand, and we've all been teenagers once, when we feel criticism, judgment, anxiety, anger, then that's where we start getting the feeling of unsafe, and that's where it has an effect on our learning. So I just wanted to start with this idea of emotion, so we're all sort of on the same page, I hope. So I wanted to look a little bit at this idea of memory and linking it to imagery. And I think we're so incredibly lucky that we teach language, because in the language classroom, we have so many tools at our fingertips, so many things that we can do. We can use images, we can use videos, we can use music. We're incredibly lucky because we can learn languages in so many different ways. But if we think about this idea of memory, and I don't want to make you cry on a Saturday morning, but I'm sure we all know students forget so, so easily. Not just students, we all do. But the statistics are, and you may have come across these before, that we tend to forget more or less 56% of what we've learned in 1 hour. Okay, so if you think of your lovely lesson plan and all the work you put into your hour of lessons, after 1 hour, more or less half of that is already kind of gone out the window. 66% in 1 day and 75% in 6 days. Okay. And so when you come back after 1 week, it can seem like, but were they not here last week? But we did this. You did, but they don't remember. And when we think about this idea of memory, it's actually what the brain is supposed to do, because we know through evolution, the brain was focused once upon a time only on survival. And so anything that was seen as surplus just wasn't important to remember. So our irregular verbs that we feel so passionate about just really aren't that important to the brain, because we're wired to forget things. And I think that can kind of be a bit consoling as teachers. And I think if we know students will forget, then that can help us approach lessons and thinking, well, how can we help them remember? There have been so many studies again about this idea of memory, and a very famous one, which was carried out probably about 100 years ago, was the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, which basically illustrates what I was saying before about how quickly students forget. And when they carried out these tests again 100 years later, obviously they expected to have different results, didn't they? Because we're so advanced and we're so wonderful now. But no, the results were exactly the same. So this is something definitely to bear in mind. But I want to talk about the idea of imagery, because these statistics hold unless we reinforce what we're learning, unless we go back to it with revision, which we do, or perhaps if we link imagery to what we're learning. So for example, if I asked you how many windows there are in your home, okay, so I just give you a moment to think. Some of you might be thinking a lot. You might have very big homes. I don't know. But I can guarantee you that to probably come up with that answer, you've now mentally walked through your home kind of thinking, okay, 2 in the kitchen, 2 in the living room, and you're somehow getting to that number. And this is because we're very visual. We don't think in words, we think in images. So if I say the word tree to you, you're not going to see the word tree. You're going to imagine a tree. If I say beach to you, which today would be a bit chilly, at least in Italy for the beach, again, you're not going to see the word, you're going to imagine a beach. And what you imagine is going to be very different to what I imagine, perhaps. In the 2 pictures here, somebody might imagine a beach full of deck chairs and sun loungers, whereas I would think of a very natural, windy beach in Ireland. That's my connection. And so when we connect the words that we're teaching, the language we're teaching, when we connect it to images, this makes it much easier for students to remember because they're connecting in a second way. There've again been studies conducted by neuroscientists at MIT, and it shows that the human brain can process entire images that the eye sees for as little as 13 milliseconds. Now, I can't tell you exactly how short 13 milliseconds is, but I reckon it's very, very short. Okay, and we're going to do an experiment now. I'm going to show a picture to you, and it probably won't be 30 milliseconds. It might be a little bit longer than that, but I want you to try to remember as much as you can. Okay, because I'm going to ask you some questions. Are you ready? Are you super focused, concentrated, excited about this moment? Okay, here's a picture. There we go. Okay, so if I were to ask you, in your opinion, what season did you see? So you can use the chat box if you want to. Spring, summer, spring, okay, summer. Okay, How many people were in the picture? Was it crowded or was the scene quite empty? 8. Oh, somebody's really, really precise. Not crowded. Few, many people. Some people, it was quite empty. All right. Where was the scene? Was it like in a busy city centre? What did you see? It was a park near a lake. Yeah, a lake in front of a house in a park. Okay, which country? If you had to guess, which country do you think this picture was taken in? The UK. The UK, Canada. UK, Ireland, Canada. Okay, wonderful. So let me just go back here for a moment and we'll see how good you are. And I think you were wonderful, actually. There you go. Okay. So this is the picture you saw. So it's just to illustrate the fact that just with that little second, how much the brain has already processed. So the brain is incredibly connected to images. And on the side, this is an activity I use very, very often to revise vocabulary with students, because we can obviously choose whichever topic for here. For example, it could be great. What were they wearing? What was the weather like? What season was it, etc. If I were to ask you another question, do you find it easier to remember names or faces? What would you tell me? Faces, 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 faces for sure, faces. Okay. And I will also say I'm not very good at remembering names. So I would also remember faces better. And this again, if we think about it, the visuals, so the faces, are stored in the long-term memory as opposed to words, which get stored in the short-term memory, which is why it's so easy sometimes to remember a face that you can be walking down the street, you remember a face and kind of go, oh, what's their name though? Because that's the part that's harder to remember. This information, coupled with the fact that nearly 65% of the population are visual learners, means that integrating visuals help us to learn better and they help us to remember. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. And we've heard this expression before, and that's to kind of illustrate why. So I want to kind of link this for a moment to the inner game. And I don't know if you've come across this expression before. It was an expression which was coined by a sports coach called Galway in the 1970s, because he was looking at sports people, in particular tennis players, practicing, and he realized that so much effort and attention was being given to the physicality of the sport, the physical movements, and nothing was really being done about what was going on inside the brain. And if we think about, we've just said a moment ago, how important the images are and what we visualize, then, you know, it made sense to him that we also tap into that. And so this idea of the inner game was that the players would visualize what was going to happen in a match. So if we look at the wonderful Roger Federer here, that he would go through the steps, the emotions of what he would feel before he was going to take a shot and visualize that shot happening. And this was extremely powerful, and it's used by sports people today because you're pretty much telling yourself in your brain, this is what I think is going to happen, this kind of repetition. And we know, I love this video of looking at what's happening inside the brain. I mean, I don't watch it every evening or anything, but I just find it fascinating that the brain is constantly changing, because sometimes we feel that, you know, things are fixed and that's the way it is, but it isn't. And we know that, especially as teachers, every time we teach something to students and they learn something, the neurons fire together. Okay. And we know that when the neurons continue to fire, we're building up a memory, we're building up knowledge in the brain. And also when we don't come back to something, the neurons fade because it's constantly changing and evolving. And I'm going to come back to this later about what's going on in the brain and how we can use this as a real source of power for us and for our students. So I just want to move on for a moment to the fact of why our students get distracted. Well, at least my students get distracted. I hope it's not just me. Do your students also get distracted in class, or are they hanging on your every word and listening to every word they say? My students get distracted. very often. And we all get distracted, don't we? I mean, again, going back to our analogy of the car, also here, sometimes it happens, doesn't it? Where you're driving your car, maybe you get to work and you arrive outside your school and you kind of look around and think, am I already here? And you don't remember anything of the journey. And this happens so much to all of us that we're sort of on automatic pilot. So we're going through the actions, our body is there, but our mind is somewhere else because maybe we're thinking about our grocery shop we have to do later. Perhaps we're dwelling on an argument that happened yesterday. The mind is full of thoughts, full of thoughts. And there are studies that we could spend up to about 47% in a day stuck in these kind of thoughts. As Nihan wrote in the chat there, being on automatic pilot. Yeah. And unfortunately, the kind of thoughts that we tend to get stuck on don't tend to always be the positive thoughts. They tend to be more negative thoughts that maybe we're thinking about a mistake we've made because we're very harsh on ourselves, aren't we? Talking about compassion. Sometimes we have so much compassion for others, but not so much for ourselves. When we make a mistake, we go over it and over it and over it and think, how could I have done that? And we regret the past. Or we get really, really worried about the future. We imagine these bad things happening. And this kind of rumination kind of exasperates feelings. And sometimes we can kind of lose perspective. We're also very creative. I mean, I think we can be more creative than Steven Spielberg sometimes. We create whole films and stories in our minds. We can have arguments with people who are not even there. We can hold on to stories, to situations that maybe happened 20 years ago, that still we hear a piece of music, maybe this story comes back. We can project a lot of attitudes, assumptions onto other people because of what we believe they're thinking. And so sometimes we're not really listening with our ears, we're listening with our minds. And so what we imagine the reality of the situation to be can have very little to do with the actual reality. And so sometimes we can spend a huge amount of time up here. And I always think it's sort of like the washing machine, that things are just going around and around and around. And so 47%, that's a lot. That's a lot of time. And if we go back to our friend, the caveman, again, we don't need to, feel bad if this happens because it happens to all of us. Please don't think I'm the Dalai Lama. This happens to me too, because evolution has programmed us to be on the lookout for danger. Okay, and so we have a very strong threat detector. It's one of the oldest, most primitive parts of the brain, and it's always scanning the environment to assess for safety. We saw before how important safety is. It's the second level on Maslow's hierarchy. And so we're always alerted to signs of trouble. We're always alerted to kind of the negative, the problems. But the problem is that we can always find something to worry about. The brain never runs out of problems. We can try very hard. Sometimes it's more difficult to find the positives, but if we need to find a problem, the negative in a situation, we can do that quite easily. The problem with that, though, is that it becomes, I like this expression, the flashlight of the mind. So when we see a negative situation, when we're feeling these intense negative emotion, the attention focuses on that. And it's good in a sense because it helps us to focus our full attention on the threat, on the problem, but we lose the ability to see the bigger picture and we can lose the context of the situation. And that maybe can be all that we're focusing on. Has it ever happened to you, for example, if we think about this busy mind, that maybe you're having a conversation with somebody and you find yourself saying things like, oh, I'm sorry, my mind was somewhere else. Or were you saying something? Sorry, I didn't catch that, because we weren't actually listening. We weren't actually present in that moment because we were having a whole other conversation in our heads, possibly with an imaginary person or with somebody else. We weren't actually in that moment talking to the person. And this can have an impact as well in the classroom. If we think about the classroom, that maybe our students, sometimes we miss out on things students tell us because as teachers, our minds also fly as well as our students. What can we do? What can we do about this? Because here we're not going to just present the challenges, but also try to find some solutions. And one of the most simple things is to take a breath. And people say this sometimes, just take a deep breath. And I'm sure somebody has said this too over the years. And it's this idea of a deliberate pause before speaking. And this is always not that easy to do. This is something that takes practice. But taking a deliberate pause allows us to sort of get out of this sort of unmindful chattering and just take a moment, that it's not this sort of semi-conscious speech, that we check in with ourselves, we think about what we're going to say. And then if we also feel, maybe this doesn't feel right, then maybe we don't say it, that we become aware of what we're saying to others. And I think that's also a hallmark of emotional intelligence. But this idea of pausing in the classroom as well, it's very, very important. Um, I worked for many, many years as a director of studies in a school, and a very big privilege of that job was that I was allowed to observe many, many teachers teaching, and I learned so much from that. And I'm always grateful for the teachers that allowed me to sit in and see their lessons, because it's quite a vulnerable thing to do, isn't it? And one of the things that always made me very aware was how little silence there was in the classroom, and how often we would forget to pause, that maybe we would ask a question and we wouldn't always maybe give the time to students to stop and think, but we would be ready with the next question and we would follow up, because sometimes silence can feel very uncomfortable. And silence in a classroom can feel very uncomfortable. But if we think about a school day, it's so busy, it's so hectic, there's so many things going on, that sometimes a moment of silence can actually be extremely welcome for students and for teachers. And so one very short little activity, which is quite nice, is to take a minute in the classroom, because 60 seconds is a powerful amount of time. And I do this very often with students, that I say, maybe we just need a minute, where the students would stand up, which is also quite refreshing, I think, when you've been sitting all day. And they put their hands, if they're wearing watches, they put their hands by their sides so they're not looking at them. And together, I ask them to feel 60 seconds passing. And when they feel 60 seconds have passed, they sit down. So it's not a competition. With little ones in primary, sometimes we can approach it as, let's see who can get nearest to 60, so that they have kind of an objective for doing it. But the objective of this is just really to have a moment of silence in the classroom for everybody to sort of gather their thoughts and reset. And from my experience of doing this very often with students, when they sit back down after that minute of silence, there's a different sort of atmosphere in the classroom. Okay. Towards the end of the session, I'll also be mentioning a couple of other activities that hopefully could be useful for you. But before we get to that, I just want to kind of close this sort of topic of this unmindful communication, of the body is in one place doing one thing and the mind is somewhere else entirely. And if we think about the impact of this on teaching, on learning, on remembering, if we're not there and we're not really listening because our mind is someplace else, it reduces performance, it increases stress, because what we said before, when the mind is flying away, it's not usually flying away on positive things. Okay, it can impair communication, and it can also damage relationships, because I think there's only so many times you can say to somebody, sorry, what were you saying? Can you repeat that as well, before somebody gets a little bit fed up? And so I said, I think these are things for us to be aware of as educators, because we're always on our own pathway, aren't we, of learning and improving and trying to do things better. And if we think about our students, again, as we said, how distracted are they? What's going on in their minds? Also the little ones, sometimes they have their thoughts and their worries. And so I think sometimes when we come into our lesson and we have our wonderful lesson plan and we're ready to get stuck into the present perfect, that taking that moment of sort of looking around the room and saying, are they mentally even with me? Because if they're not, then what are they really going to get from the lesson? And so sometimes having that 1 minute of giving them a moment to arrive, of getting into the space, we don't know what's happened in the lesson before. We don't know what they're going to go into. Maybe they're going to go into a test, the lesson afterwards. And so their mind is focusing on that. So having these very short activities sometimes of just helping them arrive into the lesson with you, into that space, can make a huge difference towards the outcome, the learning outcomes of that lesson. So going back to our inner game, what we mentioned before, and the mindsets. So we saw our wonderful featherer there a few moments ago, and we spoke about Galway and this idea of visualizing and getting into your mind before you even do something, and how powerful that is. And so if we think of our minds and what we said before, this busy mind, which is full of thoughts, and tapping into that and trying to make that a more positive place to be, let's say. I wanted to share a study with you, which I don't know if you've come across before. It was a study which was carried out in Harvard University by Professor Alvaro Pascual Leone, and I apologize for my horrendous pronunciation. But basically the experiment was that they had two groups of volunteers. And they wanted to teach the volunteers 5 basic piano notes, okay? In one group, the volunteers would literally touch the piano and learn how to carry out these notes, okay? And obviously they saw through repetition and practice, we saw before all the neurons in the brain, the motor cortex remembered those notes, and it strengthened so that when they would come back another time to play those notes on the piano, they would remember that sequence of notes. And this is, we know this, practice makes perfect, and this is why we say practice makes perfect, because the neurons become stronger and stronger. Instead, in the other group, though, what was very, very interesting was the other group were never near a piano. They were just asked to visualize touching these 5 notes. And when they checked the motor cortex of the other group, they found the very same results. And I find that shocking, but not surprising, because the brain is such an incredible thing. And so the study, as I mentioned, we understood how a mere thought can change the brain in fundamental ways. Thinking and thinking alone had this effect. And it's called the virtual piano study. So just through imagining the notes, it didn't even touch the keyboard. And so this is going back to the idea of the inner game, of imagining something happening. It changes the brain. And sometimes we forget the fact that the brain can change. And this is the beauty of neuroplasticity. Have you ever heard of Tom Hanks? Are we Tom Hanks? Does somebody know who he is? Yes, maybe. Famous actor. I see the chat box is lighting up here, so somebody knows who Tom Hanks is. Of course we know who Tom Hanks is. What sort of questions are you asking me, Chantelle, on a Saturday morning? Yes, and we know Tom Hanks through Forrest Gump. I think has to be one of my favorite films ever, and so many beautiful films, and he's interpreted so many films. But I remember reading an interview which was about Tom Hanks a couple of years ago. And when you think of Tom Hanks, you know, he's a Hollywood actor, he's a beautiful wife, successful career, probably all the money in the world. So his life should be perfect, shouldn't it? And yet he mentions in these interviews, he's very open and honest about the fact that he lives in his mind. He's somebody that spends a huge amount of time going over things, ruminating. And he said, some people go to bed at night thinking that was a good day. I'm one of those who worries and asks, how did I screw up today? And he's very open and honest about the fact that he gets stuck in these cycles of negative thinking. And while I'm sorry for Tom Hanks, I think it's also very reassuring, you know, that this can happen to all of us, that we get stuck in these ruts of rumination. When we get stuck in the negative, so thinking of our mindsets, we get stuck in the negative. Sometimes we predict what's going to happen. We somehow magically have a crystal ball. I know I'll say something stupid, everyone will laugh at me, I'll never be able to speak English. If we think of our students, speaking another language is incredibly scary. You feel so vulnerable. You really have to put yourself out there. And so they have that fear of, you know, not wanting to speak in front of others. They feel they know what everyone else is thinking. I don't think my teacher believes in me. Everyone will think I sound strange when I speak English. Or, this kind of negative self-talk. My friends are better than me. I'm not good at studying. Everyone finds it easy. I'm struggling. But remember what we said before about the brain, about the neuroplasticity. If I keep telling myself, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't speak English, we're strengthening that thought. And we can make our world or break our world by our thinking. And it's very important. I'm sure we've all had this over the years where there's some students that put up a mental block. And when we talk about learning and remembering, if they have this mental block where they've convinced themselves they can't do something, then this can be very, very challenging. I remember once, and this will show you how long I've been teaching, bringing out a tape recorder in a lesson and a student bursting into tears. And I was a very young teacher at the time, and I was so surprised. And so I spoke to her after the lesson. And she was terrified of listening to English because she said, I can't understand. And for me, it's almost an instrument of torture. And that was a very big lesson to me in the emotions students feel in the classroom that sometimes we're not even aware of because of their past experiences, which they've kept with them. So if we think about the mindsets, and I'm sure you've possibly come across this before, that we talk about having maybe a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. And it's very much connected to how you feel, if your abilities can change or not. So if we talk about a fixed mindset, it describes children and adults who believe their intelligence, their talents, their personalities, they can't grow. That's who I am. That's my ability. And it will always be like that. Okay. Instead, with a growth mindset, it's more the idea that through hard work, through dedication, not through the magic wand, through hard work, dedication, the brain and the talent, that's just a starting point. So I can improve. And obviously in the classroom, if we have students with a growth mindset, it makes it a lot easier. Yes, from Drake, I've seen in the chat box. It makes it a lot easier, doesn't it, to help them to learn a language. But our job isn't just to help students who have a growth mindset. Our job is to help all students learn a language. So how do we do that? It's, I think, a very important reflection is to taking this pause, taking a moment and really looking at the students and saying, is there something going on here that I'm not catching? Are they standing in their own way, maybe? Listening, and this is where we talk about being mindful, being in the classroom, really listening to the comments that they maybe make about themselves. I can't do this. And that you realize that they're really convincing themselves out of learning a language. And I think it's also a very good reflection to recognize ourselves. Maybe because sometimes we have a growth mindset for many things, and then we feel very blocked or a fixed mindset for other things. When it comes to identifying our strengths, and this is what we want to do so often with our students, is to help them see how great they are at things. They need our support in this, because sometimes it can be very difficult to identify your own strengths because you kind of overlook them because it's part of who you are. So you take it for granted. And so sometimes you kind of need another person to say, but you're a really great listener, or you're really collaborating well in that team. You go, oh, but that's just how I collaborate. Yeah, but not everybody collaborates in that way. You're doing it really, really well. Sometimes students need to hear those kind of messages to build their self-confidence, and for them to also see it in themselves. And I think that's where that sort of support that we can give as teachers to sort of vulnerable young people, that when they're being so hard on themselves, when they're being really without any kind of compassion, that we can come in there and try to support them and help them and let them see where their strengths are. Connected to this, I don't know if you've heard of the ABC model, is that sometimes we come across in life, life is full of adversities where, for example, maybe a student might fail an exam. And very often that adversity that happens can turn into a belief, which is, so I'm terrible at English. And we saw before how fast the brain is at focusing on the negative. But then that can have a consequence, which is feeling hopeless, which is maybe giving up studying English altogether. And the brain can go there very quickly. But there are so many studies that says we can actually learn to recognize unhelpful thinking strategies and replace them with more positive ones. So rather than taking this unhelpful negative thought and allowing it to escalate and destroy us, deplete us, because sometimes we can, that we somehow are aware that we can catch it, challenge it, and choose a more helpful response so that we can train this kind of thinking. Okay. And this is where the pausing and the silence comes in, that we take a moment before we jump to B, before we jump to C, we take a moment to reflect on failing an exam. And I think as teachers, this is where we can also help our students to reflect that it's not the end of the world, it's part of the learning curve. So I just want to come to the last part of the session. I hope you're all still with me. So talking about self-compassion, what we're saying before is that we can be so incredibly hard and tough on ourselves. And so I want to look also at some very short activities of trying to bring an element of mindfulness into the class, of trying to get students to step away from unhelpful thinking strategies, which can block their learning and their remembering. So I imagine, but I shouldn't jump to conclusions, that if you're here this morning, that you're probably familiar with mindfulness already. And if we look at this little picture here, it's just the idea of being in the present moment. And not allowing ourselves to be fully distracted by thoughts, of bringing ourselves into the present moment, really living all of our moments, rather than just kind of going through the motions and going through being on autopilot. And that might sound like a very easy thing to say or do, but it isn't. I've been practicing mindfulness for many, many years, and I was very lucky as a teenager in secondary school that we were taught meditation. And so it's been a part of my life for a very long time. But I can promise you that there are times, even now after practicing for so long, where you want to bring yourself into the present moment and your mind will fly. And then you want to bring yourself into the present moment and your mind will fly. And it's sort of this internal battle sometimes. But what we said before is that the mind changes, thinking of the neuroplasticity, thinking of the experiment with the piano, thinking of the inner game. The mind is extremely powerful. And if we continually bring the mind back, bring the mind back, bring the mind back, the brain changes. And when the brain changes, it stops us just reacting to situations and it helps us be more present. We talked before about taking a breath and why that's so important. And I think it's incredibly, it's really fundamental to reflect on this idea of stress. I think there's a huge amount of stress in our lives. And when a person is under stress, the body changes. And this is why they say stress is dangerous for us, isn't it? Because the breathing pattern changes. An anxious person will take small, shallow breaths. They'll use their shoulders rather than their diaphragm, their lungs. And this style of breathing disrupts the balance in the gases and it exasperates the situation. And so very often when a person is feeling stressed, somebody will say, oh, calm down, which is possibly the worst thing you can say to somebody in a situation when they're already feeling stressed, calm down. And, you know, there would probably be, well, I would love to do that. But sometimes people don't know how to calm down because they've never been taught. And I think we're all guilty of saying to children, calm down. A child has absolutely no idea how to calm down if they haven't been taught how to calm down. But I would believe that the moment to learn how to calm down isn't when you're already feeling stressed out. The moment to learn how to calm down and to practice coping strategies is when you're already calm, of understanding that if I get into a situation of stress, I have a tool. And why we say the breath is that it's the most important thing we have. It's what starts our life, and unfortunately, it's what ends our life. It's always with us. It's always with us. And so in a moment of stress, we can always go inwards and have this breath to connect us. And this is such a powerful thing and such a wonderful tool we have if we learn how to use it. One of the things that I've probably taught my children from when they're very, very little is breathing when they're feeling stressed, but using colours. And if you like, we can take a little moment. We're getting towards the end of the session. So you can also have a second of silence from my voice. That if you want to take a nice deep breath in, and what I'd ask you if you want to try is that when you take the breath in, you imagine that the breath coming in is blue. Okay, you can, if you want, you can close your eyes or you can just cast your eyes down, but you imagine this sort of cooling sensation, this lovely blue calming color that's coming in, that you breathe in, and then you release with your out breath the color red. So all of that tension, that stress, anxiety of getting that out of your system. So if you like, we can just take 2 breaths together of taking a deep breath in, imagining the blue calming waves washing over us, holding for a second, and releasing. We'll just take another breath together. So breathing in, blue, and breathing out, red. Even just 2 or 3 breaths will change these gases in the body and slowly, slowly will make us feel calmer and a little bit more in control. Sometimes as well, when our brains, as we said, are the washing machines, and we're feeling stressed, and we're feeling anxious, again, it can be hard to come back. And so a very nice practice, again, is using your body. You don't need anything else, is connecting yourself to your senses. So looking around you, naming 3 things you can see, then naming 3 sounds that you hear, and then finally moving 3 parts of your body, perhaps your ankles, your fingers, your arm, and you're just bringing yourself back into your body when you feel your brain going 100 miles an hour. This can be sort of a trick to just bring you back to the present moment, and it's just getting that sort of perspective. When we talk about little children, and while I teach also in secondary school, I do a lot of projects with primary school, and I love working with kids. But one of the things we do see is that children can feel so uncomfortable with very big feelings, those big feelings of sadness, of anger, of stress, because they don't think it's temporary, because they don't have life experience. They don't realize that the good days will come again, that today is just a temporary glitch, it's just a bad moment. They don't have that perspective. And so they can feel very, very uncomfortable. And I'm sure we've all been around a child who's had a complete meltdown because they really feel that's the end of it all. And that's where parents and adults come in, isn't it? Because it's not an equal relationship. And there's a really lovely expression I remember coming across, that we have to be patient with children because God hasn't finished working on them yet. And so they're a little work in progress. And so it's our job to kind of not join in the chaos, but to add our calm to the situation. And so a very nice activity, thinking of the primary classroom, because perhaps some of you are also in primary, is thinking of, connecting our feelings to the weather, that the weather is not permanent either, especially if you come from a country like I do in Ireland, where you can have 5 seasons, not even 4 seasons in an hour. And so having students connect their thoughts of how they're feeling. Another little activity which with the little ones is really lovely is where they can create a rainbow. And it's lovely when they create that themselves. And it's called rainbow breathing. And the idea is literally that they put their finger on the rainbow. And so they breathe in, they get to the top of the rainbow, and they breathe out. And then they do the next color and they breathe in. They get to the top of the rainbow and they breathe out. And without realizing it, you're getting the little ones to take 3 or 4 deep breaths, and then they can just put their hand on their heart. And that's a really lovely activity. And they get quite excited when they have to take out their rainbows, especially if they've made them themselves. Another activity, and just to give some ideas, and I'm sure you have so many others, and there's so many different activities, and different things work for different people as well. One activity which is also very beautiful is mindful watching. So seeing, looking at something. I'm very fortunate to have a lovely garden in my home where for me, it's my peace, my solitude. I spend a lot of time in my garden, and I have some roses, which my garden was abandoned for 2 years before I took it on, and so it was a jungle. And so these roses are really, really beautiful. And sort of looking, this lovely meditation of the heart of the rose. If you just look at this picture, the inside of a rose is so intricate. It's so beautiful, the shade, the light. And again, just taking the time perhaps to look at something, really, really look at something. And then your mind will drift away, and that's absolutely fine. You don't need to beat yourself up about that. It happens to all of us. And then you just bring it back and kind of say, no, in this moment, I want to focus on this. And your mind will go and you'll bring it back. And your mind will go and you'll bring it back. But you'll persevere. And as we said, this wonderful brain will change. So when the attention drifts away, whatever it is you're looking at, that you don't need to criticize yourself. So just the last two or 3 points. One, it can be very useful, for example, to have also, we have our phones with us, probably too much nowadays, but a mindful app is very nice. I have a little mindfulness bell on my phone, and this as well, that sometimes just when you're getting caught up in activities, that the bell goes and it reminds me to just take a moment to breathe, to take a step back. And that's kind of creating a window, isn't it? Where you just remember to catch a moment as it goes by. You stop, you breathe, you notice, and then we go on with our lives. Okay. All of this is connected. So this wonderful project is mindful and compassionate. The mindful and compassionate project. And I think sometimes we don't dedicate enough times to ourselves, and this idea of self-care, of looking after ourselves, it's not self-indulgence, it's an ability to care for others in a sustainable way. It helps to enhance our mental health, ours and our students, and it avoids burnout. And as written here, you've heard this expression, you can't pour from an empty cup. So we have to also look after ourselves too. A very nice activity I also do with students and adults too, actually, is what kind words can you say to yourself, where students do an outline of a hand. I believe I am. Because as you said, when we have to talk about the negatives, we're wonderful. We can have a huge long list. But what about the positive words? And so this can be really lovely. With YLs, I display these in the classrooms. And when kids are having a bad day, it's nice to look at your hand, though. Look at all those wonderful, wonderful words to help them try to gain some perspective. So the closing thoughts, one, I think it's important to think about gratitude. So what went well today? Also in the classroom, reflecting on the end of lessons. Are we rushing to the bell? Are students putting on their backpacks as we're calling out the homework? Or are we finishing maybe 5-10 minutes before the end of a lesson, even 5 minutes, and taking that moment to stop, reflect and think, well, what happened today? What did we learn today? What are we leaving the classroom with? The attention is very high at the end of the classroom, so that can be a very powerful moment. Also thinking, what is something that you learned today in this classroom, and focusing on the positives that they feel leaving, well, that lesson wasn't for nothing, I've learned something. And this idea of recognizing the good, and certainly gratitude, and there would be a lot to say just about that. But if we talk about the stress that we spoke about before and the cortisol hormone, that immediately reduces it by 20%, because we can't complain and be negative and be grateful at the same time. They're opposing. And so when we're focusing on the positives and we're being grateful, we are automatically not speaking in a negative way to ourselves and to others. Very last thought, the first and last 10 minutes of your day. Life is incredibly busy. We all have so many things to do, so many demands in our time. But there are so many studies that say that even if during the day you're rushing and racing, how you start your day, the first 10 minutes, and how you end your day, the last 10 minutes, can have a huge impact on our well-being and on our mental health. And so this is, a reflection. After this session on Saturday, you're going to go out to this beautiful day on Earth and enjoy a lovely Saturday. And I hope as you go through the day that maybe you'll capture a moment. There's so much out there. We're so lucky. We have everything and so much beautiful nature. And maybe when you get towards the end of your day today, that you'll have that moment of just taking a breath, taking a moment for you and thinking, this wasn't a bad Saturday, was it? And having a restful sleep after that. So the 10 minutes of your day, it's worth reflecting. Is it a way to set up your day in the best way? Or are you maybe causing stress in the moment going through social media? It's worth a reflection. It's an individual thing we can all do. And I think that's it. Okay, I think you've heard more than enough from me, and I'm sorry I might have run over by a couple of minutes, so I apologize for that. I'll stop sharing the screen so you can see. Oh, Anna, I love your hearts. They're beautiful. Okay. If you would like to turn your cameras back on, it's lovely to see your lovely faces behind the names, so we can have a moment together. I don't know if there's any reflections, anything that you'd like to share, to say, if there's anything you want to write in the chat box, any questions, that we have another few minutes together.
I think Nihan will comment briefly on your wonderful presentation. Okay, so Nihan, thank you.
Thank you, Yuse. Chantal, that was really, really engaging presentation. Thank you. I really liked actually the real life examples. I think we all find some familiar stories in our life. And that was really great job. It was 1 hour, but it was really engaging. Thank you for this amazing presentation.
Thank you. Very sweet. It's lovely being with you all, and thank you so much for giving up your time on a Saturday morning. Our little team here really appreciates it so much. And thank you for your very kind comments. You make my Saturday so much better.
We had only one question.
Yeah.
Let me share from Svil Gelinskate from Lithuania. Will there be materials available for us to reflect one more time? I'm hopeless this morning at note taking.
Okay. I mean, this is something we can talk about. We can perhaps share a little summary note. I know that, it's something we can talk. I'm sure, we can probably share something with you. We won't be sending all of the slides, but perhaps a couple of references. I didn't include a bibliography here, but maybe that's something we can talk about and share. Thank you for your interest in learning more. Definitely one resource that I did mention through the talk is Mindfulness for Teachers is a beautiful resource. And there's another book as well called The Invisible Classroom, which again, everything that's kind of going on beneath the surface that we're not always aware of. So they're two very nice resources if you want to read and reflect a little bit more. Thank you for your Anna. That's lovely. Your reflections help me to improve my growth mindset. As we said, we're all a work in progress, aren't we? And that's also beautiful. It's always something new to learn and think about. Okay.